Kingsley Abbott, thank you very much for being with us today. We really appreciate your time. We know you are a very busy man. So thank you very much for your time. To begin, in your personal view, what is human rights work about, and why do you think it's important?
Well, there's a very technical answer that somebody could give, which is trying to promote and protect all the international human rights conventions which contain the different guarantees that states have to give in terms of human rights. But the real answer is that it is about improving the lives of people. If you look at the different human rights that people have, they have not only things like the right not to be tortured and the right not to be killed, but they also have the right to education and the right to health, the right to water. And this is important because it's about improving the day-to-day lives of ordinary people.
Can you share some experiences from your day-to-day work with us? What are challenges that you encounter? What does your day-to-day work look like? Can you share maybe some positive or some negative experience that you've had, and how do you overcome challenges?
Well, my work is mostly focused these days on accountability for gross human rights violations. And so that has me travelling all over the world, hoping to promote accountability and end impunity in different parts of the globe. I think one of the interesting parts of my work is that we are involved in trying to promote accountability from the top down and from the bottom up. So at the very top level, we are trying to develop international law and standards which are aimed towards ending impunity at the very highest level. And then at a level lower down, we are working with governments, hoping that those governments will then adopt those laws and adopt those standards and apply them domestically. Then at the domestic level, we're working with different justice sector actors like judges and lawyers and prosecutors, training them and building their capacity to deliver justice. And then also working with victims and communities and civil society, helping improve their capacity and their knowledge so that they can seek justice within that framework. So in real terms, what that has me doing often is sitting at my desk, helping develop in Word documents different international standards that might apply, sending them around to different actors around the world, working collaboratively with them. It also has me sitting quite often with justice sector actors such as judges and lawyers and prosecutors, whether in a formal setting or an informal setting, sometimes over dinner, sometimes in their offices, and developing potential programs that they might be interested in requesting. And that could be doing a training or a workshop on the international standards that apply to investigations, or the international law and standards that apply to a victim's right to remedies and reparation, the independence of the judiciary, judicial accountability. But I think some of the most rewarding parts of my work is working with civil society and working with affected communities. It's also the most challenging part of my work, because as a lawyer, I think we are often quite comfortable sitting with our legal colleagues talking about these things theoretically. But it's tremendously challenging, and there's a very big burden on us when we sit with affected communities, civil society, and victims of these crimes. Often they don't have a legal background, they don't think about their experiences in terms of an international legal framework, and the challenge for me is often to pull down all of that international law and make it accessible and relevant to the lives of victims in civil society. And you know, they are often people who have had terrible life experiences. They often have very high expectations for what they want from us and from the international justice framework. And often there is, I think, a real importance in building relationships with these people in a way that you can actually help and support them without bamboozling them with a whole lot of international human rights law and standards. I think some of the positive parts of my work, and I think the most difficult is the same as the most positive, which is working with those people, working with victims, working with civil society. I think many of the most inspirational people I've met and the people that keep me going are human rights defenders in their own countries, victims of gross human rights violations, often people who've had their families killed. They're often working inside their own countries where they are enormously vulnerable to any kind of retaliation. They've had traumatic experiences in their lives. Often they've been fighting for accountability for many, many years, sometimes decades. And I greatly admire their strength and their tenacity, and they inspire me on a daily basis. And so that is, I think, the most rewarding part of my work. I think sometimes the most difficult part of my work is sometimes having to make peace that you are not always going to get the results you want quickly. The international human rights movement, the international justice movement, is something that requires the input and the commitment of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people all over the world in order for it to make it work. And often change is slow coming. Often it's one or two steps back as you make one or two steps forward. And particularly in the current global environment, it's becoming more and more difficult because people are now challenging the international human rights framework, multilateralism, globalism. And so we're really having to find new voices and new ways of promoting human rights in that context. I think that we continue doing the work that we do because we believe it's the right thing to do. I think it's important to contribute a human rights narrative to all the different discussions that are going on around the world, whether it's in the media, whether it's in local communities, whether it's with governments. And I also think that we believe in the fact that over time change will come. As someone famous once said, the arc of justice bends towards the outcomes we wish for. And so there have been several instances where we have had good results, quite a number. I mean, the fact that the international human rights framework even exists is a post-World War II miracle. The fact that now before the Human Rights Council, states are having to come together, account for their work on human rights or their failings and be reviewed by their peers, other states around the world, is something that would have been mostly unthinkable of pre the 1940s. I think also, there are more specific examples that we can give where we have now cases around the world where perpetrators of human rights violations have been held to account in international and domestic justice systems. And that only happened because those international laws, those international standards were developed. They were adopted by states, often with the pressure from civil society and from victims. And there are countless examples of that around the world. In a more sort of micro level, you look at different states like Thailand. Thailand has made some progress in some areas. For example, working with the judiciary, we talked the other day about how victims of violations in the country aren't always aware of what different accesses they might have to remedies and reparations within the justice system. And so the judiciary took that advice on board and have now sent out a memorandum around the country, making it an important part of each legal process that victims are advised of what their rights and remedies might be. We also worked on some international standards for the investigation of unlawful deaths, and the Thai police and the Thai prosecution and some of the educators within that system have come to us and adopted some of those standards into their training materials. So there are good results on the big stage and good results on the smaller stage as well.
Does it ever get easier? I mean, taking it back to the grassroots level, I was struck by that you said that you also obviously encounter victims, people that have been at the wrong end of human rights abuses. Do you feel that there is any specific skill set that you need for your job? Is there any specific training that you receive when it comes to this? How do I deal with people that have been abused, or how do I deal with victims? Does that ever get easier, and is there any specific training that you receive or have received that you think back to a lot, that you make use of?
Yeah, like I said, I think it's one of the most challenging parts of my work to work with affected communities, to work with victims on the ground, because you don't learn those skills in law school. You don't learn them working as I did in international criminal tribunals. They're really life skills for the most part. You have to be able to be a lawyer who can go and sit and empathise, do a lot more listening than talking, and you have to be able to always be calibrating what you're saying to a level, a non-legal technical level that they can understand. So I think one of the biggest gaps that I sometimes see, which I think requires a lot of skill, is to be able to translate a lot of this technical information and technical knowledge into a way in which it might be useful and easily understandable by community, civil society and affected groups. And within those groups there's a huge range of knowledge. Some people are very educated and are already quite aware of a lot of these issues. Some other people have had no education whatsoever. And they're not interested in hearing from me about international treaties and conventions. They want to know from me how we can help them help themselves. So I would say that one of the greatest skills, I think, for human rights work is, for want of better words, a sort of empathy, compassion, people skills. You also often have to take your ego out of the equation and really do a lot more listening than talking, particularly in the early stages, as I said.
The ICJ and yourself, you truly work globally. You have experience in many different regions of the world. Is there, to your mind, are there stark differences in how you approach communities in different regions? And then also, following on from that, how do you feel about the different regions? Where is it, may it be easier in one region than in another to actually file a human rights complaint, for instance? So you must be, obviously, when you go into these communities, you must be very culturally aware of where you are. You must also be technically aware of what the mechanisms are, because obviously they are all different in the regions. So what is your experience? What is your experience there?
I think that one of the worst things that an international human rights organisation can do is parachute into a new context and a new situation and start telling everybody what to do. And I've seen that unfortunately happen in some situations. I think that in order to be successful in any country, we have to be sure, first of all, that we have something valuable that the people on the ground actually welcome and would like to learn more about and to receive training on. So the early days should always begin with a pretty detailed assessment as to whether or not our advice and input is welcome. And before we start working in a country, usually it's not until we receive an invitation from people, whether it's in the government or victims or civil society, inviting us to come and help them with their work. I think usually that needs to begin with a very detailed assessment of the context first. I think before any of us go into a new country, we try and talk to as many experts as we can, with a strong emphasis on experts from the region, nationals of the country that we are thinking about working within. And then when we actually arrive in the country, we are enormously dependent on local assistance, whether it's local civil society, whether it's interpreters and translators, whether it's lawyers on the ground who are bilingual or multilingual who can assist us. And it's important also to begin very slowly, as I said, to really spend a lot of time listening to local actors so that we can understand through their voices what the situation is, and then perhaps in some instances mutually identify some issues that we could assist them with. But I think it's important to emphasize that our work is really to support the work that people in their own countries are already doing, and to identify ways in which we might be able to help them without getting in their way, without standing on their work.
Do you have any concrete examples of this? So you go into a community or any region that you've been to, what is something that you have done concretely?
Well, I think there are many examples around the world. Usually we will begin by talking to local civil society and local lawyers in our case, and often victims of violations in that area. And so an example might be in the deep south of Thailand, where there's a long-standing insurgency down there. A lot of violations also have been documented as being committed by the state. And when we began working in the Deep South, we started by approaching local lawyers, the Muslim Attorney Centre, and learning from them what the context was, how we might be able to assist them. We also spoke to a number of local civil society groups in the Deep South, and often when we would do activities either with civil society, with the lawyers, or later with the governments, we would do it in partnership with other local actors. So it would be very rarely that we would do anything on our own. And then at another level, we often employ staff to work on those teams from the country. So here in Thailand, our Thailand team is made up of a strong contingent of Thai lawyers who are very familiar with the context within the country, and without them we wouldn't be able to do our work. In Myanmar, for example, it's the same thing. When we started working in Myanmar, we first spoke as much as we could to local civil society, local lawyers, to the government, identified ways in which we might be welcome to assist. And now fast forward several years, our team in Myanmar is made up of quite a number of Myanmar lawyers from different parts of the country. A lot of the activities we conduct are in partnership with Myanmar organisations, and the work that we're doing with the government requires us to go and sit with different Myanmar officials and identify with them ways in which we might be able to also help the government at the same time meet their international human rights obligations. So at each step of the process, we're engaging as much as possible with local actors, whether it's in the Deep South of Thailand, Myanmar, Middle East and North Africa, Latin America, or elsewhere.
Great, thank you. Human rights is an incredibly important subject. Some critics may argue it's sometimes a little bit soft, a soft issue, hard to grasp. Before we move on to a more maybe theoretical question, I want to ask you about money. When you have an idea for a project, or when you encounter a situation where you know assistance is needed, it won't work unless you have the financial support. So in your profession, how do you deal with this? How do you get funding for specific projects that you are working on, and how do you develop the funds to support the important work that you do?
I'll begin by answering your first question about whether I see human rights as a soft issue. And I have heard people say that to me in the past. My own background is coming from being a criminal prosecutor and criminal defence lawyer in my home country of New Zealand, and also working in the International Criminal Tribunals. I think the work I do with the International Commission of Jurists on human rights is some of the most difficult, sharpest work that I've ever had to do. And I think when people talk about it being a soft issue, they might be talking about things about which there's already a lot of agreement. So the right to health, the right to education, the right to water, the right to food, and this kind of thing. And they might say, well, nobody disagrees with those things. But in fact, there's a tremendous struggle going on around the world with gross inequality. Often the victims are the most marginalised. It's some of the toughest fights that are going on globally at the moment. And then with respect to the kind of work I do, which is to focus on gross human rights violations, or violations that might amount to crimes under international law, we are here in the human rights sphere talking about crimes against humanity, genocide, extrajudicial killings, torture. And when I work with victims of those crimes, you're working with some of the most desperate, the most marginalised, those who have suffered the most. The subject matter is sometimes enormously difficult to grapple with for them and for anyone who is trying to assist them. And then often when you're working with states on those issues, that is when a state is at its most defensive and often most unwilling to cooperate. And then when you get to possible accountability mechanisms, like the International Criminal Court or some of the other mechanisms that have been set up around the world, here within the human rights framework, you're really fighting for access to justice for victims, for some of the most serious crimes in the world, where there is, as I said before, a tremendous, often a tremendous unwillingness to recognise those rights that victims have, because it might amount also to some kind of acknowledgement that violations took place, which certain states are unwilling to do at different stages of their development. I also think that sometimes when people talk about human rights being a bit soft, they might also be talking about fundamental freedoms like freedom of expression or freedom of association, freedom of assembly. But in different parts of the world, those are some of the most difficult rights that people are fighting for. You only have to look at places like Hong Kong at the moment, places like Tiananmen Square in the past in China, even in the past in Thailand. There have been well-documented cases of retaliation against people for merely wanting to express their right to call for human rights, their right to call for democracy, their right to call for a transparent government. In many instances, it has even resulted in people being tortured and killed for their efforts. So I've heard before it said that human rights is a soft area of the law, but that has not been my experience.
Okay, great. Going back to funding, what strategies can you employ?
Okay, well I think with respect to funding and developing projects, the first challenge is to come up with an idea that you think is in fact going to be useful. And you need to be able to articulate from the very beginning what your objectives are, what activities you want to implement to meet those objectives, and what outcomes you expect from them. And that's what donors want to hear. Often the instinct is to say, well, working on human rights is just valuable in and of itself. It's just valuable per se. Why do I have to explain all these things? But donors, and rightly so, want to know in more detail what precisely it is your plans are, and actually that is sometimes challenging. So I think that there's several steps to the process. The first is to come up with your idea. The second is to reduce that idea to a particular objective. And when you reduce it to a particular objective, it requires, I think, pretty detailed and close consultation with a wide range of actors, whether it be victims, whether it be civil society, whether it be the government, whoever you think will be the beneficiaries of that work, in order to streamline and sharpen precisely what it is you're trying to achieve. And then when you develop certain activities, the temptation should not just be to develop a lot of different conferences for people to talk. Often donors want to see something more practical, something more targeted. Are the right people in the room? What precisely are you discussing? Have you first of all done a baseline assessment as to what the issues are before you get everybody in a room to talk about them? And is there going to be any follow-up? Because I think often the challenge that donors see is that a lot of work is done on a particular issue for 2 years and then it's dropped. And then you need to be able to identify your outcomes, like what do you actually hope to achieve by the end of this? Do you hope to achieve some kind of in-country or regional standards? Do you hope for there to be more strategic litigation cases in courts? Do you hope that the domestic legislation in a certain country is going to be reformed? You have to be very clear about those things. And then once you think you've got it down in a 2-page, 3-page document, which is very tight and very logical, then I think there's the more pragmatic work that you have to do, which is to approach donors. And usually that's flows in both directions. Often it will involve my colleagues and I going to donors with ideas and pitching those ideas to them, and then coming back and saying, yes, we're interested in this, or this is something that might be dealt with by somebody else, maybe even in another part of the world, if it's a state and they might have a headquarters, a capital city. And then you're often the one doing the running and pitching your proposal. And then at the other end, often different donors, like states, will issue calls for proposals where the state itself will develop what it thinks its priorities should be in a certain region or a certain country or globally. They might say that they want to work on the rights of women in Thailand or access to justice for victims in Myanmar. And then we keep an eye on those calls for proposals, and when they come up, if we think that it aligns with work that we could do or are doing, then we will submit proposals to those calls.
Some argue that, I'm sure you've heard this before, you've been working in, again, like I say, you work globally, you encounter a lot of critics of human rights concept as well, and one criticism that you come across, I would imagine, or too often, is that people say, well, human rights it's a Western concept. If you go towards the developing world, the global South, and you come with human rights, it is merely an instrument of the Western powers to further their own agendas. What do you reply?
It's a question I often get asked, or a question that I often get challenged with by different people. And it's something that I have never really understood through the lens of my own experience and my own work. I think there's several ways of answering that question. One is to state a fact, which is that particularly after the Second World War and subsequently in the 1960s, when different countries, including in the global South, were throwing off their colonial rulers, it was often countries in the global South that were the ones who were most calling for international laws to be developed that were binding on countries that upheld human rights. So historically it's false to say that countries in the global South have no interest in human rights. I think on another level, of the many hundreds, if not thousands, of conversations I've had with different actors in the global South, it has invariably been government officials that have suggested to me that in some way human rights is a Western concept being imposed on them. However, the vast majority of civil society members, ordinary citizens, victims of human rights violations I speak to wouldn't agree with that at all. They want their human rights. Often they can articulate what their rights are that they want. Sometimes they can't even articulate necessarily which rights it is that they want, but they have an inherent sense of justice. They have an inherent sense of wanting accountability. There are places in the global South I've been where I have met with human rights defenders and victims who have no legal education, who couldn't name all the international human rights treaties, but they are better able to articulate the human rights that they want than I am, because they feel it inside of themselves as a matter of the human experience, particularly people who have suffered violations themselves. And then I think another way of answering that question is to ask ourselves, which isn't always done, when it's suggested, do people in the global South really want human rights? As a good lawyer, I want to say, well, let's start by some definitions. What are human rights? Let's list a few of them and see if that's something that people might want. The right not to be arbitrarily deprived of your life. Generally, there's some agreement on it. The right not to be tortured. Oh, yeah, I think that's a good one. The right to be able to associate with the people you wish to associate with. The right not to be arbitrarily detained. If you are arrested and placed in a court, the right to receive a fair trial. There's very few people I've met who disagree with any of those. And then you look at economic, social and cultural rights. Oh, do we think it's important that people be educated? Oh, that sounds good. What about the right to food and water? Oh, we agree with that. And then by the time you get to the end of the list of human rights, there's very few people who actually disagree when you have a concrete discussion about this. And I think, lastly, I would say that if you look at the experience of the global South, what's going on in the last 100 years, in the last 10 years, in the last 6 months, there are countless examples of people calling for their human rights. You look at protests in Latin America, you look at the recent protests in Hong Kong, you look at protests that have taken place even here in Thailand, where people have stood on the streets in front of the state, as often people say, speaking truth to power, saying, we want the state to guarantee our human rights, we want accountability for past violations, we want remedies and reparations, and we want to be able to improve the quality of our lives, whether it's not to be killed, but also to be educated, to have health, to have food, to have water.
Last question, and following on from the examples that you've already just mentioned. If you look around the globe, what are some of the trends that really encourage you in your work at the moment? And what are maybe some of the trends where you think, now this really concerns me, this is maybe worse than it has ever been?
I think some of the trends that encourage me is that where we're at in 2019 in terms of having the tools to promote human rights. We're at an unprecedented stage in history. If we were having this conversation in the 1920s or the 1930s, I wouldn't have been able to point to that many international human rights mechanisms, that many international laws that states have agreed to be bound by that enumerate what human rights are. There was no UN Human Rights Council. There was no International Criminal Court. And so, in fact, the framework that we have to work with in 2019 is something to be very encouraged by. I think also, globally, there are some positive developments in terms of the reduction of poverty, the quality of life of people around the world. If you look at the way in which the world was decimated post-World War II, which wasn't that long ago, it was in my father's lifetime, where we're at in 2019, I think that the quality of life, or the median quality of life for people around the world is better than it was in 1945. So that's a positive development as well. In terms of negative developments, I think that there are, at the moment, and it's gathering pace, a lot of criticisms that are now becoming mainstream of the international human rights legal framework. There are criticisms of the way in which countries are being asked to accept refugees, for example. And the global refugee and migrant crisis is an important challenge that needs to be addressed. But it need not be addressed by closing borders, by building walls, by dividing us, particularly when we're talking about people who are fleeing from persecution and fleeing from conflict. I think a second global trend which is very concerning is the attacks on the free media, to start to say that the media is the enemy of the people, that the media can't be trusted, to end up with a population that is bamboozled as to what the truth is or isn't, and therefore are no longer equipped to be able to make informed decisions in terms of electing political representatives and the proper functioning of the democratic system. I think we're also seeing attacks on the judiciary around the world and different justice sector actors, that certain states are saying, look, these issues, whether they be purely political or not, have gone through the justice system, and if independent judges have not ruled in my favour, then it is because those judges are biased, those judges are political, you can no longer trust the judiciary. And so you slowly start to see the erosion of public trust in those institutions which are there in order to guarantee human rights. We're also seeing a lot of attacks on civil society around the world. The idea that civil society is in fact not there to promote for the better quality of life for people within a certain country or a certain region. They're actually there as a destabilizing force, that they're in some way a group of people who do not love their countries and who need to be silenced, either in the worst ways possible or by legal harassment. And this is gaining more traction around the world as well. And there are numerous other trends that we are seeing that all seem to be coagulating at the moment. But I think that the solution to a lot of those challenges is to go back and regroup on what I began by saying, which is that we have the tools at hand to deal with a lot of these issues. We have a relatively strong international legal framework that enumerates and describes what human rights are. We have different mechanisms where human rights violations can be raised and discussed. So we know what the rights are, we know what the obligations of states are, and I think what's required, first and foremost, is more global leadership on those issues. Who has the primary obligation under the International Human Rights Framework to promote and protect human rights? It's states. States are the obligation holders. They are the ones who have the duties. And so we need more leadership from around the world in terms of heads of states, judiciaries, different government actors, to stand firm on a principled basis to say freedom of expression should be guaranteed, freedom of assembly should be guaranteed, the independence of the judiciary should be guaranteed. With respect to refugees, if you want to know how to deal with the refugee crisis, many of the answers can be found in the International Refugee Convention. And how are we going to develop a response that is consistent with international human rights law? And I think, unfortunately, there's something of a trend at the moment away from that global leadership. and it's complex and multifaceted in a way that we can't possibly address in this discussion. But I hope that there's a reversal in that. And I think you can see some leadership around the world. It's not just because I'm from New Zealand, but I think New Zealand is a good example at the moment with our Prime Minister Jacinta Ardern, who in response to a number of crises in our country in recent months stood out and stood very firm, taking a very compassionate and principled stance on different human rights issues. And I think now is the time for different countries, for smaller countries, to start standing up and providing examples, providing support to other countries, and being flag bearers for the international human rights cause as something that isn't just good because it's good, but it's something that actually leads to some of the things that countries want to have, like sustainable development, like stability, like a happy, prosperous people within the country. Many of the answers to those things can be found in the international human rights framework. It requires more global leadership on that.
Great points. Kingsley Abbott, thank you so much for your time and for sharing some of your tremendous experiences with us.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.